Hello everyone, and welcome to this podcast for cell biology. In this podcast, we're going to talk about photosynthesis and the chloroplast. We've already talked about the chloroplast, but we're going to spend more time talking about it in greater detail towards the end of this podcast. Now, before we jump into photosynthesis, let's think about where we've been the past few podcasts. And remember, we talked a lot about how we take a glucose molecule and convert it into 6 CO2, 6 water molecules, and lots of ATP. And remember, in order to release the potential energy found in these chemical bonds of this glucose molecule, so we can make these products, particularly ATP, we require oxygen. In fact, we require 6 molecules of oxygen. And remember, this occurred through the series of cellular reactions that we'll collectively call cellular respiration. Remember, that included glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. But where did this glucose come from? Now, for you and me and other animals, we get this glucose simply by eating food. But ultimately, how did that food get glucose? That's what we're going to spend a lot of the next 2 classes talking about. How we're going to take these products of cellular respiration and we're going to use them in photosynthesis. So we're going to take these 6 carbon dioxides, 6 water molecules, and through the reactions of photosynthesis, we're going to produce glucose. Then glucose can be used in cellular respiration. Now, over here during cellular respiration, all that potential energy needed to generate these products is stored up in the chemical bonds of glucose. Where does the energy come from to build glucose from 6 carbon dioxides and 6 water? That energy comes from our good friend, the sun. The sun, through its photons, are going to provide the energy necessary for these reactions. I always find this amazing because the sun, remember, is about 93 million miles away. Yet it provides the energy necessary to make glucose and ultimately the energy necessary to sustain life on Earth. And it's 93 million miles away. And I also want you to think of the sun as having something we will call light energy. It produces something with chemical energy, so photosynthesis involves the process of converting this light energy into chemical energy. So let's have a working definition of photosynthesis. Up here we have the chemical reaction of photosynthesis. 6 CO2s plus 6 waters go on to produce glucose. And I should also mention another very important product of photosynthesis, and that is oxygen. Can't forget oxygen. We can think of photosynthesis as a set of reactions driven by sunlight, or we could say light energy, that will synthesize organic material. And what I mean by that is essentially glucose from CO2 and water. Okay, I'm going to erase this on the bottom here because I want to next talk a little bit about the kinds of organisms that undergo photosynthesis. So not every living organism can undergo photosynthesis. Now, the organisms that can, we call autotrophs. Autotroph means self-nourishing, which means simply they make their own food. They make their own glucose. These include plants, some bacteria, like the cyanobacteria and green algae. As I said, not all organisms are able to undergo photosynthesis, so not all organisms are autotrophs. Those that aren't are called heterotrophs. Heterotrophs receive their nourishments through a different source, so they have to consume their food or their nourishment. So which organisms are heterotrophs? All animals, most protists, fungi, and most bacteria. Alright, next I would like to briefly introduce you to the two stages of photosynthesis and talk about where they occur within a photosynthetic organism. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the chloroplast and the stages of photosynthesis. So I'm going to draw a large chloroplast here. Like the mitochondrion, the chloroplast also has an inner and an outer membrane. So we have an outer membrane here, which I'm just going to put OM, and an inner membrane here. Just like the mitochondrion, the outer membrane is much more porous, whereas the inner membrane is much more selective. If you remember, with mitochondria, the inside part was called the matrix. But with chloroplasts, we call this inside part the stroma. Unlike the mitochondrion, the chloroplast has a very special set of membranes on the inside of the stroma. Each of these we call the thylakoid. The stack of thylakoids are called grana. Inside of the thylakoid membranes, these grana, is where we see this pigment. These pigments here, and I'll just make a little key down here, are usually, not always, but are usually of the type that we call chlorophyll. And we'll spend more time talking about chlorophyll in a little bit. Now's a good time to talk about the first part of photosynthesis, what we'll call stage 1. We will also call it the light reactions. Stage 1 of photosynthesis takes energy from the sun with water and will make oxygen. And oxygen will now leave the chloroplast. Stage 1 will also produce ATP and NADPH. If you get confused about whether it's NADH or NADPH associated with photosynthesis, just remember the letter P is in NADPH, which should help you remember photosynthesis. Now ATP and NADPH will now be used in stage 2 of photosynthesis. We'll often call this the Calvin cycle. You may have heard this at some point in your life called the dark reactions or the dark cycle. We no longer call it that because it becomes confusing, because sometimes people will interpret that to mean that this part of photosynthesis has to occur in the dark. Stage 2 can occur in the light or the dark. It has no bearing on whether or not stage 2 will occur. Stage 1 requires the sun, requires the light, so it's still appropriate to call it the light reactions. Okay, so ATP and NADPH get fed into this cycle. In addition to ATP and NADPH being fed into this cycle, carbon dioxide enters the chloroplast and is added into this cyclical reactions. From stage 2 and subsequent reactions, sugars are made, like glucose, which then are taken out of the chloroplast. Now what you might have noticed is that oxygen and sugar, two of the main products of photosynthesis are exported out of the chloroplast. And if you remember from the past few classes, sugar and oxygen are the key ingredients for cellular respiration. So that's where we get these products for respiration, from photosynthesis. You might have also noticed that the two products of cellular respiration, CO2 and water, are the beginning points of each of the stages of photosynthesis. In this way, the two pathways of photosynthesis and cellular respiration are linked. Also, it's important to remember that I'm talking about a photosynthetic organism here, but don't forget that within this same cell, there would be mitochondria that would use this oxygen and the breakdown components of sugar to generate ATP. So how do we get our sugar? Since we don't make our own, we either consume plants that have sugar in them because they've made it through photosynthesis, or we consume animals which have eaten the plants. So ultimately, our energy comes from the plant, either directly by eating the plants or by eating organisms that have eaten the plants themselves. Now, a couple other things I want to remind you about chloroplasts, as well as mitochondria, but particularly chloroplasts, since that's what we're talking about now, is that the process by which plant cells, or photosynthetic organisms, gained chloroplasts was through a similar process that all eukaryotes gained a mitochondria. And that process, to remind you, was called endosymbiosis. For that reason, as we've talked about before, mitochondria have their own DNA, as do chloroplasts. They also have their own genomes. Okay, that's all I want to say in this first podcast. And in the next podcast, we're going to spend more time talking about light energy, pigments, and specifically chlorophyll. If you have any questions about the information in this podcast, make sure you let me know. If not, I'll see you in class. Bye.